This morning we are talking about coming into the presence of God through the garden gate. Okay, so that's quite relevant, through the garden gate. We are busy with a series called Being or Becoming the Prevailing Church. And I've said it enough times that we should all know it. Good morning, you guys, as well. The prevailing church is not the persevering church. It's not that we don't persevere, but it doesn't mean to be clinging on white-knuckled. The prevailing church means the thriving church, the overcoming church, the victorious church. The church that Christ is coming back for, and when He comes back and He asks the question, will I find faith on the earth? It's the church that will shout out, yes, Lord, and here we are. And so in that series, we started off by talking about, at the moment, we're talking about coming into His presence. But we started off, the first part of the series was coming into His presence or becoming a prevailing church through purity. And then secondly, the second part of the series was we spent some time on coming into His presence or becoming the prevailing church through prayer. And now we're on the third leg thereof, if you want to call it that. And it's coming into becoming this prevailing church through the presence of God. And it's important that we realize that although our next step will be coming into prevailing through the power of God, and that it's not a case of 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 = 5. It's not a case of purity plus prayer plus presence plus power equals prevailing church. It's not a formula. It's not a recipe that if I add these things together, then 1, 2, 3, and we end up in His presence. These might be different or are different disciplines, and they are valuable, but they're not a recipe. It's about desiring the presence of God more than anything else. So I really want to stress the fact that coming into God's presence is not reserved for a select few, like it was in the Old Testament. It is not difficult, and secondly, and thirdly, it is not dependent on perfection, perfect holiness, sinless holiness, or definitely not dependent on works or rituals or rules. So we need to know that coming into His presence is not limited to the select few. It is not difficult, and it is not dependent on our works or our performance. Right, that's hopefully simple enough. Why is it not? Because Jesus Himself paid the price for us. He reopened the door. He reopened the possibility so that we can be restored. Our presence with the Father can be restored. And although, amazing enough, perfection and holiness are required, and sinlessness are required to come into the presence of the Father. Because it's impossible to be in the presence of the Father unless we are perfect and holy and sinless. It's not based on our holiness, perfection, and sinlessness, but it's the fact that we enter through the blood of the Lamb. It's Him, Jesus Christ, and what He has done on the cross that actually qualifies us to enter. And this is why Jesus said in John 14:6, no one comes to the Father but through me. So the whole concept of coming into the presence of the Father, although it's not for a select few, although it's not difficult, although it doesn't require perfect sinless holiness, it is based on the grace and the goodness and the kindness of the cross of Jesus Christ. No one comes to the Father except through me. So that's the first thing that we really need to get on the belt. So today I want to take us on a journey into the presence of God through the garden gate. And actually we're going to go through 3 gardens, a journey that will take us full circle from a garden in which there was the perfect presence of God into a different walk, which turned out to be a meander through a sinful wilderness, back into a third garden, which brings us back into the perfect presence of God. So let's start with a journey through the 3 gardens. The first, obviously, our story starts in the book of Genesis, with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Simple enough. Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. Now, the Lord had planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and he put the man there, the man that he had formed. I love the fact that the garden was planted by God. It wasn't by human effort. It wasn't God that provided the seeds and gave a lecture on agriculture. But God himself, the Lord God, planted a garden in the east. In other words, a garden of absolute perfection. And then God made two perfect humans, sinless, and placed them within this garden. Verse 22 to 25, then of Genesis chapter 2, then the Lord made woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought it to the man. And the man said, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of the man. For this reason, a man will leave his mother and father, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. The man and his woman, the man and his wife, were both naked, and they felt no shame. I love that. This is really important. The man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. So it really is interesting that our story begins in the Garden of Eden, which is also the Garden of Purity. And that's where our series started. The place of purity. It begins the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Purity, the Garden of no shame, the Garden of nothing to hide, the Garden of perfect union between God and man. And it was natural. This perfect union, this perfect presence between God and man was natural. It was effortless. There was effortless fellowship between God and man as God came in the evenings. It says, in the cool of the day, God would come and walk with Adam and Eve in this garden, just in the beautiful sense of unity and fellowship and the presence of God. Both the garden, as we've mentioned, both the garden and its inhabitants were perfect and sinless in every way. In other words, this was a prototype. This was actually a picture of as it is in heaven, so let it be on the earth, where both the place and the people were perfect, holy, and sinless. I just want us to get that picture. And because of that, God and man was in perfect unity and in perfect relationship and in perfect fellowship. And so now our story continues. Adam received an instruction from God. In Genesis 1 verse 28, it says, God blessed them and said, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and every living creature that moves on the ground. So basically, God is saying that he should maintain this perfection that he was placed into, and that he should also increase its borders. So we have a perfect garden with perfect man and woman inside, and the holiness, the perfection, the closeness with God is there. And God says, now multiply this. Through your fruitfulness and through your relationship with me, let's multiply this, because there was a border to this garden. It's almost if you've seen The Lion King, okay? And little Simba is waking up his father, and it's that you remember that scene where Sir Rabi says, your son is awake, and he says, before dawn he's your son. And in any event, he says, come on, Dad, you promised to show me the kingdom. And they go out onto Pride Rock, and he looks and he says, everything the light touches is our kingdom. And then obviously he asks about the one place the light doesn't touch. He says, what about that shadowy place there? And he says, no, that's beyond our borders. So there was a portion that was beyond the borders of the garden. Do you get this? A portion, because I don't want to drift into stuff that's not part of the notes just for time's sake, but Satan had already been cast out of heaven. Satan had already fallen. There was already this. Satan was no longer in heaven. Satan was already on the earth. But he had no right. He could not come into the garden. But the work of Adam was to increase through fruitfulness, and through this closeness of relationship with the Father, increase the boundaries of the garden until this perfection, this presence, this glory, and the holiness of God covered and filled the entire earth as the waters cover the sea. Do you get that first garden of perfection, the Garden of Eden, the garden of perfect purity? But the Garden of Eden the garden of purity, soon also became the garden of choice. The garden of having to make some choices. You see, Satan couldn't come into the garden and simply take authority, neither over the garden or over Adam and Eve, because he had no right over the inhabitants. He had no right, he had no dominion, he had no agreement with them. But this was about to change in a wink. And so having no legal right, having no power, having no authority over Adam and Eve, he actually had to talk them into, he had to convince them into handing over their rights, authority, and dominion to him. And so this he did by starting to cause doubt. Kind of doubting the goodness of God. Did God really say? And if he said, is he really that good? Is he not perhaps holding out on you? Is he not kind of holding some stuff that are you not perhaps missing out on something here? And so all of this can change in a moment if you simply, against the will of God, in disobedience to God, would eat from the forbidden fruit. And if you do that, well, then you will become like God. And so they're obliged. Coming into agreement with Satan, obviously through an act of the will, making a choice, and coming through in agreement with Satan in disobedience to God. It's impossible to have both. We can't be in obedience to God and agreement with Satan. So coming into agreement with Satan meant that they came into disobedience to God. And therefore, in that moment, everything changed in the moment. What happened is that in that moment, Adam and Eve handed over their dominion. They handed over their keys and their authority to rule and to reign. They handed that to Satan through their disobedience, by choice. Ironically, they did this. Can you remember why they did this? They did this in order to try and get something. The something that they wanted to get was to become like God. That was what they wanted. But the amazing thing is that their disobedience, their sin, cost them with the very thing that they wanted, and also the very thing that they actually already had from the very beginning. Because in all of creation, if you read Genesis 1, in all of creation, only man was created in the image and likeness of God. Only man was like God. Only man was created in the image and likeness of God. Listen to this profound quote. When we try to get through our own efforts what we already have by grace, we voluntarily put ourselves under the power of the law. I'll repeat that. When we try to get through our own efforts through works, what we already have by grace, we voluntarily put ourselves under the power of the law. And so we know the tragic ending of this first garden. Genesis chapter 3, verse 8 to 10, it says, the man and his wife, when they heard the sound of the Lord as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, this perfect moment, the moment that they probably were waiting for each day, kind of as they can hear the sound of the Lord as he comes into the garden, and they would rush towards him. Suddenly now they heard him, and what happens is it says they hid from the Lord among the trees. And the Lord called out, where are you? And they answered, I was afraid because I was naked, and so I hid. I was afraid because I was naked, and so I hid. Sin caused fear and shame and separation, hiding away. Shame, fear, I was naked, I was shameful. So I was afraid, fear, and so I hid. I separated myself from you, from the presence of God. And so to conclude this first section, verse 23 says, and so the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. Remember our theme today, our story is coming into the presence of God through the garden gate. And that was the first garden, the garden where we had the perfection, the beauty of the presence of God and man, beauty of fellowship, holiness, and how that came to an end. So this takes us, and it's quite a long jump. It jumps right to almost the end of the first gospel, Matthew chapter 26. It takes us obviously then to the second garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. Interesting that just like our series, can you remember what the second portion was? Second portion was prayer. So we started with purity, and then we moved on to prayer. And in the same way, the Garden of Gethsemane is also the garden of prayer. Matthew 26, verse 36. When Jesus with his disciples came to a place called Gethsemane, he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." Can you see that even in the closeness with Jesus between his 12, this kind of, to me, indicates something of, there's still something of a separation. You guys, the 12, even the 12, you guys wait here because I'm going there into the presence of the Father. But he took 3 with him. And so he took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee with him and along with him, and then he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. But now even you must stay here." And he went further and he started praying, and he said, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken away from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." And then he returned to his disciples and he found them sleeping. And he said, "Could you not watch with me for 1 hour?" He asked Peter. "Keep watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." Isn't it interesting that there's temptation in every garden, it would seem? "The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." And he went away a second time and he preached, "My Father, if it is possible for this cup to be taken away from me, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away from me unless I drink it, may your will be done." And then he came back and he found them asleep again because their eyes were heavy. And so he left them and he went away once more and he prayed a third time, saying the same thing. And then he returned to his disciples and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and are you still resting? Look, the hour is near, or the hour is actually here. The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Arise, let's go, for here comes my betrayer." The Garden of Gethsemane, the garden of prayer, the garden of submission to the will of the Father, the garden of submission to the will of God. Jesus said that he had come to seek and to save that which was lost, which is exactly what he did. But what is it that he came for? What is it that was lost? Firstly, obviously, mankind was lost. There was a separation, as we saw in our first picture, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Choices, a separation between man and God. But it wasn't only mankind that was lost. The keys had also been lost. The authority to rule and to reign on this planet had also been lost. And all of this changed at the crucifixion. All of this was restored so that Jesus could say, "I give to you the keys of the kingdom." When Adam and Eve sinned, in other words, when all of mankind fell, it became necessary for God's Son to become the Son of Man, to come in the form of man, to enter our realm and to fight not as God but as man on our behalf. He had to model complete authority over the realm of darkness and of evil. And how did he do this? He did this obviously by healing every sickness and disease and by driving out demons from everyone who was possessed. He had to live a perfect, holy, and sinless life, righteous and holy, which he did. And he had to use his own authority and his holiness and his perfect unity with the Father on our behalf, on behalf of others, on behalf of a sinful, fallen humankind. And then, as if all of that wasn't enough, then he still had to pay the price. He still had to pay the full price, our price. The price for our disobedience, the price for our rebellion, the price for our sinfulness. The death penalty, our death penalty, in submission to the Father. He came on behalf of sinful man, but he also came in the place of sinful man. And so in Paul's letter to the church in Philippi, it really sums it up beautifully. Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 to 8. Jesus Christ, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself even further and became obedient to death, even death on a cross, the second garden. And interesting, I'm wondering how many of us know about the third garden. In fact, it's always been there, but it's only in this week that I read it and saw it for the first time. It brings us to the third garden. This is the garden of the tomb, the garden of the presence. In John chapter 19, in case you've never seen it, John chapter 19, verse 41 to 42, it says, "At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And in this garden there was a new tomb, in which no one had ever been laid, because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there." Continuing to the next chapter, John chapter 20, verse 11 to 17, it speaks of the third day. This is the morning of the resurrection, and this is Mary Magdalene now coming to the garden. Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb, and as she wept, she bent over and she looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels there, seated where Jesus had been, one at the head and one at the foot. And so they asked her, "My Lord away, and I don't know where they've put him." And at this, she turned and she saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" Thinking that it was the gardener, again proving to us that it was a garden. She said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where he is. Tell me where you've put him, and I will go and get him." Compare this to our first garden, where mankind hid amongst the trees from the presence of God, to Mary Magdalene, one who had found the grace of God, out of whom 7 demons had been driven, coming, not hiding from, but coming to find the presence. Saying, "Where is he? What have you done with him? Where can I find him again?" Then Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned towards him and she cried out in Arabic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me." And I might be wrong, but I doubt it. I don't think Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me," because she was over there, or because she was approaching him. It was just because she was all over him. It was because she grabbed hold of him, and he said, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But rather instead, go to my friends and tell them, I'm returning to my Father and your Father, my God and your God, because presence has been restored." Because once again, that which used to be a sinful woman, which has now been cleansed, came into the presence, into the perfect unity with Jesus. And he says, "I am going to my Father and your Father. I'm going to my God and your God." And so it kind of brings us to a close in full circle. In the first garden, man was separated from God, wanting to go into hiding. In this third garden, Mary had been reunited with her Lord and her Savior, and she tightly grabbed hold of him to the point where she gently had to be asked to let go. Imagine her joy as she was reunited with the presence of God. Like the disciples, she had this walk with him physically. She was one of the few that stayed present throughout the crucifixion. And now it's it's the morning of the resurrection. She's the first one to the tomb, only wanting to serve, only wanting to bring the spices and to prepare his body. And she finds so much more. She finds presence again. That which was lost in the first garden, restored in the third garden. And she's reunited. And she's in no place of hiding. She is grabbing hold and reluctant to let go. The first garden, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Purity, which became the Garden of Choice. The second garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Garden of Prayer, which became the Garden of Submission to the will of the Father. The third garden, the Garden of the Tomb, the Garden of Presence Restored, but also the Garden of Faith, because it was through faith that Jesus was raised. Jesus did not raise himself. He had faith in the Father to raise him. In the book of Acts it says, He, God, raised this Jesus from the dead. God, the Father, raised Christ from the dead. And so, full circle. Firstly, God creating us for worship and for fellowship with him. Secondly, then, man losing all of that when man comes into agreement with Satan. And thirdly, Jesus coming to restore the fellowship. Remember, God creating us for fellowship and for worship. Jesus coming to restore the fellowship by taking us back into the presence of the Father. And so then what shall our response be to that other than worship? As we come back into fellowship, how can we not worship? So preaching for a verdict. I want us to understand that the presence, as I've mentioned, is not exclusive. It is not difficult, and it does not require perfection. But Jesus said in Matthew 14:6 that no one, John 14:6, no one comes to the Father except through me. And so, although we enter the presence by the grace of God, by the grace of the cross, we've mentioned some disciplines, the discipline of purity, of prayer, and of faith. And these are required as we desire a greater measure of the presence of God. I'm not proclaiming works at all, but there's levels, there's measures, there's depths of the presence of God. And if you're wondering where I'm getting that from the Word, Ezekiel 47, you can go check it out. Lord God, I thank you this morning that you have made a way. Thank you for the 3 gardens. Thank you, Lord, for your grace. Thank you that even though we cannot enter your presence except through sinless perfection, righteousness, and holiness, we do that very thing by entering your presence by the blood of the Lamb, Jesus the Christ. So once again, Lord, this morning we throw ourselves on your grace. We thank you for the cross. We delight ourselves in the fact that our fellowship has been restored, and we respond by worship. Amen.